Madrid, 1834. The silence within the stone walls of the royal palace has descended with a weight that would astonish even the dead. The ruthless King Ferdinand VII is no more. But the real task begins now. You are the palace's chief physician. You are charged with putting the final touches on the body of a man who reigned as the embodiment of fear for 20 years. Footsteps echo through the palace corridors, leading you to his private quarters. When the door opens, Queen Regent Maria Christina greets you, her eyes red from tears. Her lips tremble, her voice a whisper, but what she utters is a plea that will shake your sanity forever. The king's body lies before you, but it's not the frozen expression on his face that commands attention. Something lurks beneath the silk sheets, deformity that represents nature's most ironic tragedy, a curse that historians dare only whisper, carefully erased from official records. This grotesque legacy, transformed into a symbol of the lives, cries, and shame he destroyed, now awaits your protection. And for the first time you realize you are about to touch not the corpse of a ruler, but a living curse. Before delving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about these strange events lost in the shadows of history, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so we can unravel these dark mysteries together. Share your listening time in the comments, because we, from different continents and different walks of life, are somehow united by these old and forgotten stories, and so I'll share the video at a time that suits you so you can watch it right away. Our shared curiosity about the past connects us beyond time. Now take a deep breath, and let's step into one of history's darkest chambers together. Every king who ascends the throne of Spain leaves a story behind, but Ferdinand VII's story is far darker, more twisted, and more tragic than any other. This king's reign is remembered not for its achievements, but for a legacy so dark that it is remembered for shame, psychological devastation, and the centuries-long decline of Spain. Young Ferdinand grew up in the cold corridors of the palace, not with hope but with fear. The continuation of his lineage, which he was supposed to inherit, was his most intimate weakness. His body, soul and mind were torn between complex palace intrigues and the bitter weight of family secrets. However, this personal tragedy would determine the fate of not just one individual but an entire kingdom. Ferdinand's first marriage was, in reality, a nightmare. Whispers in the palace at the time suggested that the suffering experienced by the young queen, Maria Antonia, went beyond physical torment, but also spiritual. Sexual dysfunction was perceived not only as a personal failure, but also as a political weakness. But even worse was the methods Ferdinand chose to conceal this truth. Accounts within the palace claimed that Ferdinand tortured her with psychological cruelty, controlling her by poisoning her or inducing drug addiction. Maria Antonia died young, exhausted, and broken, in despair. The king's paranoia only deepened after her death. It's worth pausing here to consider, how could a king's intimate troubles become a nation's tragedy? Let's continue. Following Maria Antonia's death, Ferdinand embarked on a relentless quest to remarry. This time he targeted women with proven fertility. However, he was neither physically nor mentally healed. On the contrary, his paranoia and sadism only intensified over the years. The palace servants began to say that the sight of his naked body was tantamount to death. In this atmosphere filled with secret passages, treacherous whispers, and piercing gazes, Ferdinand ruthlessly used his power like poison, plunging headlong into the world. Witnesses to the events at the palace understood perfectly well that anyone around the king could one day be accused of treason. Rumours of conspiracy reached their peak, particularly during the El Escorial conspiracy of 1807. Ferdinand accused even his own friends of treason and knew no bounds in exposing his treachery. The king's illness was more than just a physical ailment. Some medical historians say Ferdinand suffered from a rare hormonal disorder called megaloas, which rendered his sexual function nearly impossible. This physical abnormality profoundly affected his personality and decisions. This is truly terrifying. How can a man's physical weaknesses determine the fate of a nation? And this is the question we will explore in depth in this video. The dark shadows surrounding Ferdinand's life took on a new dimension with Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion of Spain. Deposed in 1808, the king was condemned to 6 years of captivity at the Château de Valence. These years marked not only political defeat, but also the beginning of physical and spiritual devastation. Doctors examined Ferdinand's unusual anatomy with scientific curiosity. For them, This was not merely a medical case, but also the embodiment of tragedy. The abnormal size of Ferdinand's organs, his deformities, and internal scars were physical evidence of long-suppressed suffering. Each wound whispered a secret. In captivity, the king's psychological state was further fractured. When news arrived, he learned of his country's struggle for freedom and the sacrifices of the brave officers who fought on his homeland. But sadly, his greatest concern was always his own intimate matters. His war was a lonely and shameful struggle, waged in the darkness of his own body. The letters he wrote during these years reveal a dark landscape. The desperation of a man unable to understand the suffering of his people, fixated solely on his own air problems. In his world, as the country burned, his mind searched for a wife who could save it. History is not merely learned, it is felt. During Ferdinand's captivity, matters at the palace grew even more complex. Amid fierce battles between secret services and spies, the king's particular health condition served as an invaluable source of information for French intelligence. This information shaped the plots against him and attempted to weaken the Spanish resistance. When he finally returned home in 1814, the sight he encountered was disastrous. Spain was fragmented, its colonies lost, and its people weary. While the welcoming ceremonies were magnificent, Ferdinand's inner world remained fraught with turmoil. While his eyes displayed happiness on the stage, his mind wandered to the secret rooms and dark secrets of the palace. Here's a little tip. Learning about the darker aspects of historical figures also allows us to see events from a different perspective. Ferdinand's second marriage was to Maria Isabel of Portugal. This young and hopeful princess met her own nightmare within the cold walls of the palace. Her wedding night resembled not the beginning of love, but the beginning of a curse. Queen Isabel developed severe psychological problems due to the traumas she experienced. Nightmares, a stutter, and constant fear devastated her life. Secret reports from the palace doctors reveal the phantom pregnancies Isabel experienced and the fleeting hopes they gave Ferdinand. The king's paranoia was spiralling out of control, and he was his only loyal companion in the palace. Suspicions of treason, poisonings, and the constant fear of surveillance poisoned the atmosphere of the palace. The servants' accounts were a glimpse of the horrors unfolding within the palace. The events within Spain's royal palace gradually transformed into a dark drama, overshadowed by the chaos outside and the suffering of the people. Behind the dazzling tapestries and marble floors, a cold, ominous silence reigned. The storms raging within King Ferdinand VII's inner world transformed into a darkness that shook not only the palace but the entire country. Driven by his personal anatomical problems and the psychological traumas of his childhood, he gradually evolved into an increasingly ruthless and paranoid ruler. After Maria Isabel's death, the loneliness and despair that grew within the king gnawed at his mind. He now feared not only the people but also his own family, his advisors, and even the women he shared his bed. A period of complex alliances, poisonous gossip, and insidious conspiracies began between the Spanish nobility and military elite. The palace now resembled a labyrinth of shadows rather than a throne room. In a climate of self-imposed fear and insecurity, Ferdinand tightened the reins on the palace. Ruling was no longer just a matter of power for him, it was also a battle for survival. Opposition was silenced one by one, some were exiled, some disappeared mysteriously. The king became a prisoner of his own fears, lurking in the shadows. Over time, he reached a point where he believed even his own shadow was plotting treason against him. The deepest tragedy, however, lay hidden in Ferdinand's private life. His sexual dysfunction resonated not only in the bedroom but also in royal politics. The selection of new marriages was not solely based on political balance, but also on women who could offer a solution to the king's repressed desires and weaknesses. These women were often judged by their physical attractiveness or fertility potential, and then subjected to Ferdinand's control and manipulation. For them, the palace became a psychological prison, far beyond the mere dream of a crowning. In the secret compartments of the palace were small workshops accessible only to the most devoted craftsmen. Special medical devices developed in these rooms were designed to solve the king's problems. However, these were more the product of desperation than scientific progress. Some servants quietly disappeared in the morning. Others were found dead, their faces frozen with fear. Everyone was hesitant to speak, whispering, "Something is happening in the palace," but few knew what was happening. Ferdinand's loss of the throne created a major rift in Spanish society. Now not just the palace, but the entire country was reeling. Independence movements in the American colonies gained momentum. Anger against the king was no longer merely a personal matter, but a national one. Revolutionary propaganda portrayed Ferdinand as an impotent tyrant. Cartoons depicted the king struggling to hold his crown with trembling hands while fleeing from his own people. He was condemned as the man who ruined his country's destiny. Tensions also reached their peak within the palace. To protect his throne and suppress dissent, Ferdinand resorted to a last resort, the Inquisition. This medieval institution was resurrected, but this time it was based not on religious heresy but on personal feuds, sexual slander, and accusations of treason. The privacy of private life in the palace was completely destroyed. Secret walls adorned with mirrors, passages where spies lurked, a surveillance network listening in on every suspicious conversation. All of this was evidence of the deep paranoia that plagued the king's sanity. Let's pause for a moment. Hearing about such historical tragedies is heartbreaking, isn't it? Even imagining yourself living in such a time feels like suffocation. If a shiver ran through you as you read these lines, it means you share our interest in history. We can feel not only the events themselves, but also the pain behind them. After the death of Maria Isabel in 1818, Ferdinand began the search for a new wife. But this was no ordinary marriage quest. Rumours seeping out of the palace intimidated potential queens. Some had learned of the king's sexual problems, while others were aware of the strange rituals that took place behind the palace walls. The prospective candidates either returned voluntarily or collapsed spiritually under the harsh tests imposed by the royal physicians. Finally, in 1818, Maria Joseph of Saxony married Amalia. Maria Joseph was older, more experienced, and more resilient than the other wives. She was familiar with the intrigues of European courts, but she had failed to foresee the quiet terror that reigned within the stone walls of Madrid. Ferdinand's inner world was so dark that even his diplomatic composure could not protect him. The king's sexual obsessions, fits of jealousy, obsession with surveillance, and lust for power poisoned this marriage as well. Maria Joseph's life quickly descended into a drama. Not just a wife, she was tasked with appeasing the king's inner demons. He had become a hostage. As he walked through the cold corridors of the palace, he knew no one could see his true face. Every mirror was an eye, every servant a potential spy. For him, the crown was not merely an ornament, but an invisible chain. And so, Ferdinand VII's reign became a story of collapse, both personal and national. A tragic example of how a man, captive to his desires, could drag an entire country into its darkness. The palace was remembered not for its splendour, but for the silent cries within. For some kings poisoned not only their countries, but also the spirit of the times. The marriage to Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony was one of the last major turning points in Ferdinand VII's life. However, neither king nor queen could escape the shadow of their previous marriages. Ferdinand's years of paranoia, obsessions, and sexual dysfunction continued to plague both his private life and the fate of his country. The king's psychological collapse, coupled with his deteriorating health, created a sombre atmosphere in the palace. While Maria Joseph appeared more resilient than his previous wives, she was helpless in the face of the cold and harsh realities of the palace. Ferdinand now viewed everyone around him as an enemy. Even his loyal servants were suspect in his eyes. Here, I would like to ask you, my viewers, a question. Can we learn from such tragedies in history? What do you think the consequences are when power is combined with such personal tragedies? I welcome your thoughts in the comments. The pain in Ferdinand's body was accompanied by the fear in his mind. After years of medical experimentation and self-surgery, the king was gradually wasting away under the influence of despair and exhaustion. He now oscillated between consciousness and delirium, sometimes issuing orders to imaginary enemies and sometimes addressing his deceased wives. By 1833, Ferdinand VII's life came to an end. While the official cause of death was gout, palace physicians admitted that the real cause was exhaustion from decades of physical and psychological devastation. The king's autopsy revealed shocking results for all who knew him. Ferdinand's anatomical organ, according to contemporary medical reports, was of unusual length and uneven thickness. The scars and deformities found within were physical evidence of years of unsuccessful and painful sexual attempts. Furthermore, the secret surgical procedures he performed on himself testified to his despair and suffering. These details, secretly preserved in the Vatican archives, are considered one of the most gruesome secrets in royal history. This organ was no longer just a physical part, it was a symbol of shame, the corruption of power, and the tragic waste of human dignity. If you enjoy this kind of in-depth historical analysis, you can support it by clicking the like button. Ferdinand VII's death marked the beginning of a difficult period for Spain. His legacy was a dark chapter filled with a fragmented kingdom, civil wars, and economic collapse. Isabella II, whose biological children are uncertain, inherited this complex legacy. The personal tragedy he experienced in the final years of his reign coincided with the suffering and disillusionment of the Spanish people. Ferdinand VII has gone down in history as a figure who combined power and tragedy. His story has become a poignant example of how a single man's personal struggles can impact the fate of millions.